Commonwealth's attorneys and I have concluded that the NCAA sanctions were overreaching and unlawful.
Someone's got to develop a product that you and I as a consumer are going to want to buy.
The country needs a comprehensive energy plan.
Hello and welcome to another edition of For the Record. The legislature is about ready to end its summer recess and get things started in Harrisburg. And joining us today to talk about those things is Senator John Yudichak. Senator, welcome to For the Record.
Thank you.
Now, Senator, let's talk a little bit, introduce yourself a little bit, because you're not in the viewing area here. You're actually from out in the great northeast of Pennsylvania. Talk about the area that you cover.
I represent the 14th Senatorial District in northeastern Pennsylvania, which is Luzerne and Carbon, some great cities like Wilkes-Barre, Nanticoke, Pittston, and Hazleton, and some great smaller communities like Jim Thorpe and Nescahoning and Lehighton down in Carbon County. A lot of great communities, and certainly a great place to live, work, and raise your family, and a hotbed of Penn State fans.
Enjoy, as I remember as a kid saying. Now, you are a Penn State alumnus, and that's one of the things that we'd like to talk about today. Your thoughts about the Board of Trustees and what's gone on at Penn State, because you've been an outspoken critic of what's taken place with the board itself.
Yeah, we've all been disappointed. Every Penn State alum has been disappointed with how the board has handled the Sandusky scandal. Of course, you know, the shock and just sympathy that poured out from the Penn State community to the victims of Sandusky was then compounded by the actions of the board, where there was no due process to those that were involved or targeted as the scapegoat for what happened. And I think what bothers me the most is that, and I believe it was Sue Paterno who said it, you know, that this was an opportunity to be a teachable moment. This is a huge societal problem. You can go anywhere in the country and pick up a newspaper or watch a newscast and find out how someone involved in a youth athletic sport has taken advantage of a child. We need to understand that better. Unfortunately, the Board of Trustees got a mentality of, let's close the narrative and move on. Regardless of the truth, let's move on. And I've argued this point in committee hearings in Harrisburg and directed them to the members of the Board of Trustees that have testified before us. It's not time to move on. It's time to get it right. Because if you don't get it right, you're not serving those victims, and you're certainly not serving the University of Penn State.
And the Board of Trustees is made up of people that are elected as alum, which you can talk to that, but also there are many appointed roles in the board as well. And there's really been no change in the way that's been made. And in fact, the governor went ahead and added a few new people appointments as well, and you were outspoken about that too.
Yeah, well, there was one big change made, and I think it was a mistake. Back in the early 2000s, the business and industry members of the board were elected, just like the alumni or the ag community. The board itself changed that process. They bypassed the General Assembly, went to Center County Court, and made a change that they themselves would pick the business and industry members. And I think that's done a great disservice to the board in terms of the accountability of the board and in terms of openness. And we're a public institution. I've continued to argue that the Board of Trustees at Penn State cannot weave back and forth where we're going to have a private school mindset where we don't want anybody looking inside, and then the public mindset that we are, you know, the land-grant institution of Pennsylvania. And so I think those mistakes have made. I think we have to look at changing the structure of the board. The board said, yes, we have a governance problem, so they created their own governance committee. They don't have the ability to heal themselves. Jack Wagner, a former Auditor General, I think said it best, you need an independent outside organization. That's where the General Assembly plays a role. I think, you know, we have over the years, the taxpayers of Pennsylvania invested billions, not millions, billions of dollars in Penn State, and a great return on that investment. But we need to be partners. It seems that the Board of Trustees wants to be an island. And that's certainly, you know, evidence in some of their actions where it just has you scratching your head. How could they miss it? How could they not understand they are disconnected from the alumni community? They are disconnected from the General Assembly. We need the General Assembly, and I'm working with a bipartisan group. This isn't a Republican and Democratic issue. Senator Smucker, who heads the State Government Committee, who has held hearings, has done a great job in holding those hearings. And we've had good discussions on, I think, the three really main points that we have to get at. and that's the structure of the board. I think we have to reduce the size of the board. I think we have to address the business and industry side in saying that they cannot simply be selected by themselves. I think that's such a dangerous precedent. I think that the governor and the political appointments need to be addressed. And then 2, we have to look at the right to know law, and then 3, the Ethics Act. If you serve on that board of trustees, you say yes. Nobody's forcing you to serve
That's exactly right.
on that board. But with that comes an enormous responsibility to preserve the integrity of a $4.5 billion university. That has to be taken very seriously. You need to be an engaged board member. You know when you sign up that that's a serious endeavor. And unfortunately, I think you've seen over the last several years that some folks did not take that as serious, and they weren't engaged, and they didn't accept the responsibility. And so, you know, for the alumni community, for a legislator, everyone has to step up and take responsibility, and we have to get it right. And I think to get it right, you have to get to the truth.
Now, you sit on both state and local government and also appropriations. Which of the 2 committees do you think should be a better overseer of the board of trustees from the legislator's point of view?
Well, you know, that's a good point, of whether it should be the Education Committee or whether the Appropriations Committee, because we do appropriate over $300 million to the university. That's a discussion to have. But, you know, it's interesting that, you know, in other appointments that happen in whether it's a state agency or in sometimes an independent or quasi-independent agency, they have to come before the committee that oversees that. We don't have that with the Board of Trustees. They don't come before the General Assembly. They're simply appointed by the governor or they're elected through the alumni. So it is an issue that deserves to be addressed and has to be addressed by the General Assembly. We're looking at and approaching a cost to the university of over $160 million. Our public institution, the Pennsylvania State University. And for the General Assembly, after all that has happened, you know, child sex abuse, governance failure at our largest public institution, for us not to weigh in on that matter, I think would be a disservice to the taxpayers of Pennsylvania.
That's a good stopping point for us right there. Back with more For the Record. Senator John Yudichak is our guest. Back with more in a moment. Welcome back to For the Record. Our guest today is State Senator John Yudichak. Senator Yudichak, we are talking about the Board of Trustees and the fact that it's not a Republican or Democrat issue in Harrisburg. It is a Penn State thought process. In your discussions with other legislators and yourself, what number do you see as the right number of people on the Board of Trustees?
Well, I think if you can get to 25, you know, they've dropped it to 30, even though the president and the governor still are ex officio members, still in the room. I don't think that that's healthy. I think if you get to a number 25, and again, former Auditor General Jack Wagner and current Auditor General Di Pasquale, I mean, they did an extensive investigation of all the land-grant institutions, all the big schools, and we're larger than all of them. And so I think that needs to be addressed. Is there a magic number? No. But we need to have the conversation. The General Assembly and the governor needs to have a conversation about board governance at Penn State. I don't think that we can simply step back and think that Penn State and the current board is going to get it right. They have not demonstrated the ability to get it right to date, and I don't think we can expect them to do that.
Before we started taping, we talked about where you were prior, and one of the things that happened in Harrisburg with change was the pay raise of 2005. You remember the State House then, and you talked about the fact, well, just share with us the fact that, you know, what changed in Harrisburg after the pay raise?
Well, you know, I was a younger guy at the time, and I voted no on the pay raise. And some good advice from my father, who's been my mentor in politics over the years. But you did see a sea change happening. And the older leaders at the time, the folks that have been around a while, and you know, the phrase was, nobody ever gets beat over a pay raise or a pension vote. And I voted no on the pension in 2001. And all of a sudden, 100 members of the General Assembly get defeated in an election. How did that happen? The social media that really drove that, and that, you know, that kind of independent media that was able to keep the story alive. The Penn State Board of Trustees didn't learn the lesson because, you know, a very thoughtful, energetic, and intelligent group of alum have been able to drive this and say, we need to make sure that our university that we love is being run in an appropriate fashion, and you're not doing the the job. Unfortunately, they've closed ranks. They still have an inclusive nature, and that has to change. It needs to be the flagship public institution of Pennsylvania. There's so much good. My life changed by it. My wife's life changed by an education of Penn State, but also to the economy of Pennsylvania. When you're bringing in $800 million in research and development dollars, that's a big deal to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That's why it's so important for the Commonwealth, for the General Assembly and the governor to play a role in making sure that university is going in the right direction.
And the research money is one of the things that Penn State has always argued about the right to know issues about, because they've been very careful about, they don't want to, the businesses who are or agencies that are involved here with research, they don't want their competitors to know that, and that's where they've always sort of used that as the right to know.
There certainly can be exemptions, and we can certainly get to an appropriate place where we're still going to be able to do the research. We're still going to protect those donors that want to remain anonymous. However, you know, we're able to do it. The state system of higher education is fully under the right to know law. Other national research institutions across the country are under the right to know law. We can get to that point. You know, it's clear that we need to heal the Penn State community, and I think the only way you do that is if the General Assembly steps up and demonstrates to the taxpayers, to the alumni base, to all of Pennsylvania, that Penn State University is heading in the right direction in terms of right to know and accountability and transparency in their actions and how they're spending public dollars, and that the university that we care about so much is in the hands of the right people and responsible people who are engaged in governing a $4.5 billion institution.
Let's change gears and go to Harrisburg now. There are a lot of things out there on the table that Governor Corbett has tried to get done in his first 4 years. A lot of people said it's been a failing administration because none of these have been accomplished yet. Let's take them one by one, if we will. Let's talk about the way he wanted to privatize the management of the lottery system. Kathleen Kane, the Attorney General, said that was unconstitutional the way he did it. What is the legislature's viewpoint? And you're in the minority caucus in the Senate, we should point that out. What is your caucus's viewpoints on privatizing first lottery?
We're in the minority, but I don't believe I'm in the minority in terms of folks disappointed with the governor and how his team has managed the issues, the policy issues, and the lottery is a perfect example of that. I think there could have been an honest conversation about modernizing the Pennsylvania lottery system, even though the last few years it's been phenomenal. They've done a great job, and it funds so many good programs, from the property tax and rent rebate to many other senior programs. But there was no conversation. It was a unilateral decision to say we're going to privatize in the lottery system, which, you know, seniors in Pennsylvania feel an ownership of.
Of course.
And so to have that be, so when I had a senior citizen in my district come to me, well, you know, what are you going to do about this privatization of the lottery? I really don't have much of a role. The governor has unilaterally decided to go to a not only an outside firm, but a foreign firm to manage. That does not seem to be going in the right direction. They keep extending the bid. I didn't like that there was only one bid, and when you think about that, you have an open bid process. Well, the folks that have won the bid, it's been extended and extended and extended, that maybe it's time, if you're really going to be honest about it, one, run it through the legislature, go through the committee process, have a vote on it so that legislators, one way or the other, vote yes or no, and that way the public has a role. I mean, that's a public asset in my view. You know, the seniors and Pennsylvanians do own that lottery, and that's a public asset, so it should go through a public process if it's going to be sold or leased out.
With your spot in the appropriations, is there a possibility of a bill coming through that department to run legislation on privatizing it and then putting it out for bid that way?
That has not been the communication from the administration. It appears that, you know, I have not heard of any additional conversations. They continue to extend the bid and are trying to find a way to get around the constitutional issues that were raised by Attorney General Kathleen Kane.
Let's talk about privatization of the liquor stores. Where do you see that going?
That, again, another failure of the administration in terms of the General Assembly. It's interesting that the Republican majorities in the General Assembly are the highest majority since the Eisenhower administration. And having the benefit of serving both in the House and the Senate and having friends on both sides of the aisle, there's an enormous level of frustration. And part of it is a lack of engagement, a lack of, let's get into the dirt on these issues. Let's hammer them out and find a way. Now, I think there is a majority of legislators on both sides of the aisle can find a way to say we're going to modernize Pennsylvania's liquor system, that there are ways that we can improve it in terms of consumer convenience and in terms of revenue that's generated by the state. Unfortunately, I think the governor's approach was, I have an ideological view, and I want you to fit that square peg into a round hole.
Senator, that's a good stopping point. Our guest is State Senator John Yudichak. Back with more For the Record right after this. Welcome back to For the Record. Our guest is State Senator John Yudichak. Senator, I didn't mean to cut you off, but we needed to take the break. Let's talk about your thoughts on modernizing the liquor stores, and that's sort of been the real move, not to privatize, more halfway now and then eventually turn it into a hybrid maybe or something like that. What are your thoughts on the modernization? Is that more of a possibility to get through both houses?
Sitting on the Appropriation Committee, the first question that I have is a budget question. When I ask the question of the administration, well, what's it going to mean to the state budget? Well, we're going to lose $120 million if we privatize. Well, how do we replace that $120 million? What cuts are going to be? Are there going to be cuts to higher education, cuts to education, cuts to public safety to make up for that hole? And are we looking at, and are we going to get the best price if we sell this asset, again, a public asset? Right. The philosophical question of whether or not the state should be in the liquor business, that's an interesting conversation to have, but it needed to happen in 1933. But we have developed a system that certainly needs to be modernized, and the feedback from Republican and Democrats, there's no question. We can modernize it, make it better, and make it more profitable for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. When you're talking about one of the first things that this administration did was 20,000 public sector jobs went away in Pennsylvania, 20,000. Northeastern Pennsylvania, Luzerne, Carbon, highest unemployment rate last 3 years in the state, still the highest unemployment rate. So to come in and say we're going to now, on top of those 20,000, we're going to lay off another 5,000 public workers, and we're going after the small private sector business guys. What a lot of people forget is that the beer distributors have been privatized for 80 years, since Prohibition. Well, there's 10,000 jobs there that are going to be in jeopardy in handing it over to a big box retail giant. Right. So I think there needs to be a lot more conversation along modernization than on privatization when it comes to liquor stores.
Do you see privatization of liquor being done in this session?
I think it's very challenging. I think the one issue, there's two issues in my view that the General Assembly needs to address in the fall session and can get it done. There are a lot of issues that we should address, right, but the two that we can get done because there's bipartisan support, one is the reforms at Penn State. Do the board governance reforms at Penn State, and the other, and the most critical issue facing Pennsylvania today, is transportation.
That's right where I wanted to go. The Senate 45-5, you want to talk about bipartisan, $2.4 billion, correct? House version $1.6 billion. How do we bridge that gap of the $800 million between the two houses?
Well, it's a challenge. And the Senate, the reason you saw it 45-5, I mean, great leadership on the part of Senator Rafferty, the transportation chair, Senator Jake Corman, the appropriation chair, who said, listen, these investments mean jobs. These investments have a return for the taxpayers. I drove down the Bud Schuster Highway to get to the Happy Valley today, and those investments matter to the quality of life, not only in terms of safety for motorists. I mean, when we're shutting down bridges and putting weight restrictions on bridges, what you're doing is you're putting the reins on commerce in Pennsylvania. So I think my former colleagues in the House, we need to have an honest conversation that the investments that we make in transportation have an enormous return in terms of jobs in the economy. I mean, we talk about Marcellus Shale transforming Pennsylvania. It's not going to transform Pennsylvania if we don't have the infrastructure in place, if we're not investing in roads and bridges and water and sewer. I have some industrial parks in my district that because of the sewage capacity or the water capacity is at its limit because we haven't made an investment since the early 1900s. That means we can't create jobs. And so we need to get to that $2.5 billion mark. Governor needs to step up. He's the leader of his party. His party has complete control of the General Assembly. We need to see him play a leadership role in getting transportation done in the fall. They can't, and I think the mistake they made was tying it to liquor privatization or lottery privatization and trying to juggle all the, let's focus on what can be accomplished and what is in the best interest of Pennsylvanians, and that's investing in transportation.
Representative Scott Conklin from this area has talked about a constitutional convention. He's been an advocate for that. What are your thoughts on that?
I support a constitutional convention. I think whether it's limited or broad in scope, I think Pennsylvanians are ready to have a conversation about government in the 21st century. I mean, a last limited constitutional convention was in the late 60s. A lot has changed. I'm a big advocate for property tax reform. In elimination of property taxes in Pennsylvania. That has to be done through the Constitution. Things like the sales tax in Pennsylvania, the tax code hasn't really been changed since the early 60s. I think, you know, modern life and the technology of modern life and social media, all those things certainly warrant us to have a conversation and a constitutional convention. It's always healthy for government to examine itself and kind of reinvent itself as time. That's the beauty of our Constitution, whether it's the Pennsylvania Constitution or the U.S. Constitution. It's meant to evolve, and we need to evolve in Pennsylvania.
What do you say to people who say that the legislature should be part-time? My feeling is when you go to the grocery store, you're still a state senator. So why don't you share a little bit of thought on that?
It's full-time. I had a great line to, I was, you know, running from the House to the Senate. You know, one of my opponents said, Yudichak didn't do anything in the House. And my standard line was, that's funny, that's exactly what my wife says, that I didn't do anything in the House. But it's a full-time job. And now we can talk about the number, but if you're going to serve your constituents, if you're going to be an advocate in Harrisburg, it really is a full-time job.
How many people do you represent? 250,000?
Over 250,000 people. And it's, you know, I've, you know, there isn't a place that I could go where, and I love it. And I wouldn't do it if I didn't love it. That people come up, small issues and big issues, from working on a $60 million project to create jobs, or whether it's getting a property tax rent rebate for a senior. All of those things require full-time attention.
Running low on time. You're up for re-election next year. Are you going to announce right now that you're running?
I am running.
And quickly, the governor is up next year. Who do you have? Who are you represent? Who are you in favor of on this side?
I'm supporting Rob McCord. He's not announced yet. He's our state treasurer, and I think he'll do a great job.
Great job. Thank you for being here, State Senator Yudichak. State Senator John Yudichak, our guest. Thanks for joining us on WHVL's For the Record.